bit quieter. Put it at like 70% and we'll see.
Well, the world is facing huge...
Okay.
All right, and then I can adjust it from the back if we decide we want it a little bit louder.
Sure.
Or quieter.
Okay.
All right, give that a go.
Yeah, that's...
And the button at the top is so you can point at people with a laser.
nice. All right. All right. Let's see if they want to chase it around.
There you go.
Okay, let's say 3 minutes from now, or yeah.
Stick it right there. Quick sound check.
Checking the sound, seeing if it amplifies. Tap 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 tap.
It's hard to tell sometimes when they're... Try it again.
Right. Okay. I'm not getting much. Do you hear me through there?
I hear something.
You hear something. Okay.
Yeah. And I can play with the gain in the back.
Okay.
So you're good. You're hot right now. If you want to turn it off, the switch is right there on the top.
Thank you.
All right. And if you begin and there's no sound, I'll flail in the back.
Okay.
We have a student introducing you.
Yeah. No, we introduced each other.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
good. Okay, wonderful. Glad you
Hello everyone, welcome to BIOMES. This is the cross-cutting student and staff faculty-driven seminar at FBS. We take your suggestions and come out with a list of speakers that kind of cover a broad range of topics within the school. So today we're pleased to welcome Mark Bomford, who is the director of...
Who are you?
Oh, I'm Scott. I am on the BIOMES committee. It's a group of PhD and master's students that kind of facilitate the suggestions that you give us and come out with our list of speakers. So I'm pleased to welcome Mark Bomford today. He is the director of Sustainable Food Program at Yale. Prior to his time at Yale, he founded the Sustainable Food Systems at UBC. Is that
Center 4.
Center 4?
Center
sorry,
RE.
Yeah, I didn't hear too. At UBC, his current research focuses on environmental geographies of controlled environment agriculture in collaboration with the School of Geography and Environment at Oxford.
Yes.
Today he'll be speaking about the complexities of one of the more well-known methods of controlled environment agriculture, vertical farming. Thank you, Mark. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Steve. I was so excited when Melanie asked me to do this talk about 3 days ago, I think. I realized it had been 8 years since the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies had actually given me this stage all by myself for a whole lunch hour. So I was just giddy with excitement, and squealed and ran around the room and caught the first flight out of Davos to be here with you today. So it really is quite a delight. I'm also happy that this is entitled Biomes because it will be very appropriate for the talk, even though I didn't know that this was going to line up so nicely. So let me begin. On December 31st, in the closing hours of the decade, The Guardian published a plea from Sir Ian Boyd, who was the longtime chief scientific officer at DEFRA, which is the federal agency for food, agriculture and environment in the UK, to convert half of UK farmland to nature. Boyd's proposal to enlarge nature by diminishing agriculture was received with little fanfare or controversy, possibly because, in comparison to George Monbiot's proposal with the same objectives, released with much fanfare and controversy a week after Boyd's, in his Channel 4 documentary Apocalypse Cow, and a heavily commented Guardian op-ed, and a talk at the Oxford Real Farming Conference where he reported being booed to the rafters, Monbiot articulated the same position as Boyd, namely that agriculture must re-wild for planetary salvation. In Monbiot's proposal, the technology that would keep people fed while rendering farming redundant would be cellular agriculture. In Boyd's, the saving technology would be vertical farming. So, vertical farming refers to indoor agriculture with the use of environmental controls to provide optimum conditions for plant growth. It's distinguished from the broader category of controlled environment agriculture, or CEA, by its use of multiple vertical layers, unlike widespread CEA practices under transparent plastic structures or in glass greenhouses, where the sunlight still provides the majority of photosynthetic activity, and where there is still a base down below, at the very least, providing something for gravity to push against. And the use of multiple layers renders unusable potential sunlight from above for most of the crop, or any water, nutrition, or physical support from soil below, at least for all but one crop. As such, structures such as tall racks and trays support plants growing in hydroponic nutrient solutions under artificial light. The technology for growing plants in fully enclosed environments, or PFALs, plant factories with artificial light, an interesting double translated acronym that we borrowed from the Japanese, who put a lot of money into this in the 1990s. This is not new, and these technologies received considerable attention during the Cold War. So from the geopolitical strategists came funding for specialized PFALs called phytotrons. David Munns, the environmental historian, details the development of the phytotron in the Cold War in his book called Engineering the Environment. Highly recommended. He follows the rise to superiority and a decline of a certain approach to plant biology, which briefly toppled the genetic determinism of the genes equals organism deterministic equation to a more environmentally inflected determinism, basically genes plus environment equals organism. And this meant that in addition to mastering the genome, we had to master the environment if we wanted to master the organism. So the importance of agronomic advancement during the Cold War, after all, Kissinger still has attribution for the endearing phrase, food is a weapon, led to a rush for different state agricultural agencies to develop the biggest and best phytotrons staffed with the biggest and best and most brilliant scientists. This lovely image up at the top was one actually from CISRO, the Australian State Agricultural Agency. And it's a lovely visual metaphor for what is being accomplished here, right? You've got you have an unruly and an uncontrolled heterogeneous landrace there on one side, and you also have the climate signal, unruly, uncontrollable, and through the phytotron and other technologies of biopower, right there in the middle, you normalize them. So at the other side, you have predictable controlled environments and predictable controlled organisms. So yeah, nice visual metaphor, and then down below you have what these things actually looked like as interpreted for different uses and different audiences. More typical in the black and white photograph is the CISRO's phytotron, which is basically a nondescript factory building stacked with growth chambers inside. And then there's the much more imaginative climatron. There was a period of about 20 years where if you put the suffix tron on something, you could get funding. Hence, it was basically physics envy writ large. We had the cyclotrons that smashed biggish particles into tinier particles, and so what other things might we reduce by other kind of trons? So this was the climatron, which you can still see today at the Missouri Botanical Gardens. So, of course, food may be a weapon, according to Kissinger, but weapons are also weapons. And the military had money for PFALs as well, due to their interest in what we shall call extreme food security. This would be, how do we get food in war zones or zones that are uninhabitable to key U.S. military personnel, whether that's the desert or the Arctic or the fallout of a nuclear accident or strike. And of course, NASA was one of the most enthusiastic funders of PFAL research in its extended form of enclosed life more generally. Russia and the US put considerable resources into hermeneutically sealed chambers where humans could breathe and eat and defecate in cooperation with food plants for extended periods of time. These images are of one of the Soviet experiments, BIOS-3, almost the title of this talk. You can see, again, from the outside, it doesn't have any of this kind of aesthetic sublime that you might associate with vertical farming. As one of the enclosed machines for living in, it definitely has that, it's rocking that Cold War aesthetic there, especially on one particular side. And then the 1970s Back to the Land movement saw experiments with controlled environment life as well, often with the goal of complete isolation from the military-industrial complex. So from the composting toilets at the New Alchemy Institute's ARC on Cape Cod, to Biosphere 2, to the contemporary Eden Project in Cornwall, we continue to learn a great deal about both the possibilities and the limitations for plants and humans alike living in controlled environments. Biosphere 2 deserves special mention, in part because of its connections here to Yale, largely through the financial support of Ed Bass. Interest in the history of Biosphere 2 had a brief moment last year when Carl Zimmer wrote an essay that highlighted Steve Bannon's involvement in the biosphere's reinvention after several high-profile failures. You can read a lot about Biosphere 2's histories. Another Yale connection of all the books that you could read out here, I would recommend from FES alum Rebecca Rader, Dreaming the Biosphere, as the best book I've come across for this fascinating story. It would be right up there for people interested in agricultural technology more generally to read Warren Belasco's Meals to Come, which is one of these nice histories of the future if you want to see all of the examples of how we have been there before. One of the interesting analogies brought up in Dreaming the Biosphere digs a bit into the energy that was required to maintain, not always successfully, an ecological equilibrium acceptably inside the structure. The average HVAC load for this small group was about 700 kilowatt hours. And the comparison here was basically to a hippie commune on top of an aircraft carrier. There were a lot of large-scale commercial applications that were attempted in the 1980s for PFALs, and all of the ones that dealt with food were financial flops. General Mills invested a very large sum in a financially unsuccessful indoor farm in Illinois in the early 1980s. The facility, which was dubbed Phytofarms, actually plays a role in the sort of like long dragged out Malthusian versus cornucopianism debate between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, which you can read all about in Paul Saban's book, The Bet. Julian Simon brings up the astonishing yield of this facility, Phytofarms in Illinois, as evidence that land scarcity is really not a major concern. He also uses it for exactly the opposite argument, which is basically saying that because Phytofarms in its marketing materials was citing land scarcity as a reason for its very existence, it shows basically how deluded the Malthusians are. So he got double value out of that particular one in framing that argument. So food production indoors was a financial flop. when it was tried, but there were two related approaches that were tremendously successful, at least on some grounds. The first of those was growing pharmacological products indoors, both legally and clandestinely. This is where the value of the product was so much higher than for any food product, and the need for very, very precise environmental control and secrecy were both paramount. It's really hard to gain an accurate understanding of the metabolism of these systems because the legal ones are basically buried under proprietary IP laws. These would be the ones that are run by groups like Pfizer, for example, to grow like ingredients for pharmacological compounds, nutraceuticals, this kind of stuff. And then the clandestine ones are heavily protected for related but subtly different reasons. The second area, outside of the pharmacological uses, was kind of in the more porous development of protected agriculture, which doesn't insist on the same level of complete control over the environment, and actually still relies very, very heavily upon a whole range of agro-ecosystem services, including, importantly, sunlight coming from above, and climatic stability, as well as soil, if not for its ability to actually support plant growth, then at least for its ability to push back against gravity. So 20 years ago, and this would be the example of the second one, that would be a classic Venlo-type greenhouse, which is basically conquered the world in all the places where that amount of capital is justifiable for the product. You will not find, I mean, you will find those all over the Netherlands. You will not find them in the development of greenhouses in places like China or places like Spain that have far, far more protected agriculture than the Netherlands ever can. And they don't look like that at all. But back to the narrative here. 20 years ago then, PFAS and plant production in controlled environments was a mature technology with proven but very limited application. And then in 2000, Dixon Deponier, who was a parasitologist on faculty at Columbia University, who self-identified as having no agricultural experience whatsoever, he self-published the Vertical Farm essay. It proposed large PFAS in towers as a technology that would make field agriculture obsolete to the great benefit of humanity. This is not my photo montage. This was actually provided by the doctor himself. So this is, probably created by one of his students and endorsed by, appears on his website. So basically, if you are starting to get Messiah complex vibes, it's not me that's doing that to you, okay? So this essay, which kind of sat there for about 4 years, it included an appendix listing the Latin names of important infectious disease agents transmitted at the agricultural interface, was very paranoid about parasites, and it did not circulate widely, perhaps for that reason, until around 2004. When amateur architects began creating and distributing computer renderings of what vertical farms might look like. And these inspired new designs and new renderings, which quickly became iconic. And they appeared in their retro-futurist splendor on the masthead of countless good news articles online, first in environmental journalism and later in the mainstream media. In 2009, one of the first operating vertical farms was installed by the now bankrupt Valsent company in the Paignton Zoo in the UK, where it still captivates human audiences, growing produce to feed captive non-human primates. And here is a tiny clip of the opening of this.
It's facing huge problems at the moment as far as food supply is concerned and food security. Problems of climate change, problems of food miles, all kinds of things that if we're not very careful, we're going to find out that we don't have enough to feed the population of the world, and that's growing by hundreds of thousands of people. So a system like this, involving hydroponics, water, nutrients, self-contained within a building building, so it doesn't need an awful lot of agricultural land. It's got its own climate controls, so you don't have to worry about climate change.
That was my edit. That's my fault. So increasing amounts of capital and acclaim began flowing towards vertical farming startups, most prominently with the company Plenty, receiving $200 million in early stage capital in 2017, without as a company ever having grown a single head of lettuce. In 2019, 193 vertical farming companies responded to a survey administered by the consulting firm Agritecture, and the business incubator The Mixing Bowl identified 1,000 firms working within the sector. The Dubai International Airport plans to build the world's largest vertical farm in 2020, and NEOM, Saudi Arabia's proposed $500 billion smart city, plans to feed its inhabitants solely with the food of vertical farms. The idea that vertical farming will make a significant difference in global agricultural land use patterns or improve country-level food security, it severely stretches the bounds of credibility, even in a superficial analysis. Depalmier's essays, books, and talks are jam-packed with error, contradiction, and unverifiable claims. The young sector has seen a number of high-profile bankruptcies, and the MIT Media Lab's foray into the technology has recently been shuttered, mired in an unfolding scandal. Critics of the technology have aired their views. George Monbiot's 2010 attack piece on Dixon Depalmier was titled Towering Lunacy. In his May 2019 talk at the Oxford Martin School, Dr. Mike Ham, who is the C.S. Mott Professor of Sustainable Agriculture at Michigan State University, responded to Depalmier's vertical farming proposal, saying, "I'll just go on record as saying that's the silliest idea I've ever heard." Researchers with considerable experience in controlled environment agriculture have also criticized the premise that CEA might lead to land sparing. Bruce Bugbee, who's the director of the Crop Physiology Lab at Utah State University and a consultant to NASA for plant growth in the International Space Station, has developed detailed critiques he has shared in public, as has Lou Albright, who is the professor emeritus in biological and environmental engineering and former director of the Controlled Environment Agriculture program at Cornell. The critical views, though, are quickly overpowered by the torrent of praise that seems to amplify with the pursuit and deployment of greater and greater amounts of early stage capital investment. 6 minutes for you to look at something I've spliced together. This is some clips from a talk given by the illustrious Bruce Bugbee, interspersed with what would be a very typical set of promotional video journalism for vertical farms that are exciting the journalists.
Now this next slide, this by the way came out of one of my most highly cited papers ever, exploring the limits of crop productivity. It was early in my career and helped me get tenure here. It was with Frank Salisbury, for some of you that remember him.
For over 8,000 years, we've been plowing dirt to grow our food. In fact, we've gotten so good at it that over 80% of the world's farmable land is already in use. By 2050, we can expect another 3 billion people on planet Earth to join us for dinner. It's another China and India. On average, in the United States, produce travels 1,500 miles from farm to plate, losing valuable nutrients and tastes along the way. So how can we improve our food while continuing to feed the hungry masses? One answer is vertical farming. So here's the analysis. There's 4 steps, and I'll go through them quickly, and then we'll use the numbers. How we derive this is important. 90% of the photons absorbed. That means nothing falling on the ground. The canopies covering the ground the whole time. That's a very high estimate of the absorption we can get.
from photons.
All this sobering information was enough to make me consider going on voluntary hunger strike. Right now, the average farm can feed about 150 people using 230 acres of land. That's like 200 football fields. But apparently there is a way to provide fresh food to potentially 20 million people using 1/10 of that space.
Second thing that has to happen is quantum yield. After a photon absorbed, it excites one electron. That's the first step in photosynthesis. At best, that can be 0.07. The ratio is 0.07, and that comes from a paper with one of my relatively recent graduate students exploring the limits of crop productivity for lettuce. That's the highest quantum yield we got at any time.
I just landed here in O'Hare International Airport. I'm starving. I hear there's a rumor that there's a vertical farm here that feeds 10,000 people every single year. Let's go find it.
So, if we're going to use solar panels, we need 5.4 acres of solar panels to provide 1 acre of sunlight equivalent. This was an actual picture off the internet of solar photovoltaics in cropland, which I'm stunned that they put it here, but it made a nice picture for this point.
Want to go up?
Let's go up. Oh, yes, wow. This is so fun.
Multiply those together, we get the cost per mole, then our mole times 0.5 grams.
It's like a secret garden in the middle of an airport. It's totally amazing.
It's $32 of electricity to grow a kilogram of dry weight. That's if with those assumptions, especially 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
I love this.
Now, what's wheat worth? A bushel of wheat. Wheat, I think, Dave, this might be $3 or $4 a bushel, but if you have some magic, very high-end special wheat, maybe you could command $9 a bushel. A very highest end estimate, that's 32 cents a kilogram dry weight.
How many towers do we have going on here?
We have 26 towers in this garden, and each tower has 44 plants. So we're growing lots and lots of different herbs. You can see we've got basil, we've got cilantro, and then we have lots of, and sage over here. We're providing locally grown produce for restaurants that operate at the airport.
This is so amazing.
Shipped, and finally indoor farming. It's better than tomatoes, but
It's like the best parts of science fiction, isn't it? Amazing.
but it still takes more energy and produces more CO2 equivalents. John?
Is that with fossil fuels for the heating?
No, that's in addition to solar. Because in the day you don't have to heat at all, you just have to heat at night. Yep, that's...
Part of me wanted to run away and join the Green Cent Circus, and I wondered how long before it would be coming to a town near me.
So I did some calculations on getting this water. One of the things you could do in an indoor farm is just dehumidify the air and condense it and run it back to the root zone. That's what they claim. We're just going to have a big dehumidifier and get our water from the air because it'd be high humidity. How easy is that? You calculate the latent heat of condensation of water. It's enormous, 2.45 megajoules per liter, and the electricity it takes, $14 a cubic meter to get your water by condensing it out of the air. That's why we don't do that. We could do that anywhere here. We just put a big dehumidifier outside and irrigate our crops if we didn't mind paying the electric bill.
So we just picked some fresh produce. Then we're going to go to Wicker Park and make some sushi.
I have to conclude it's going to feed the rich people of the world. Maybe the people living up in Jackson Hole are going to pay $32 a pound for microgreens. But the claims are that this is going to replace field farming. And the reality is just not there.
So the contrast here is basically to emphasize that we're not even talking the same language when we're looking at the promotion of this technology and the criticism of this technology. These two things don't enter. And you can see sort of there is a contextual code of what are basically the admissible things you can communicate and the inadmissible things you can communicate. If your emissary and your promoter, your advocate, is confident, young, cosmopolitan, and uses statistics that are readily shared in infographic form, then those are compelling. If your emissary is not young, is not slim, is not well dressed, does not have a confident mode of speech, and the statistics that they rally don't fit into easy infographic form, in fact they fit into the ugliest PowerPoint you've ever seen, then those are not admissible statistics into this whole thing. So you've got like some kind of boundary around what discourse is allowable in this whole thing. So you don't actually get dialogue between these two. You don't bring these into conversation with one another at any point. So yeah, part of the reason that we have such overwhelming praise and such limited criticism is just this matter of sheer quantity. The critics of this technology are quite few in number, and the media doesn't bother talking to them anyways. And then part of the reason, of course, is of quality. So even though none of the retrofuturist Star Trek towers have ever been built, the operations that call themselves vertical farms are still able to draw upon a particular aesthetic that's really compelling. And the global scale food security and conservation narrative is beyond reproach. You can't sort of say, I don't like what you're doing, because then you would fall into the I am against global food security or I am against global conservation. And then the spokespeople are just fantastic, right? You get real life celebrities as well as those who play celebrities on TV. You have people who are young, you have the rich, you have the famous. There's approximately 1,000 videos that are uploaded to YouTube every year reporting on vertical farming that give it similar treatment to the clips that you saw there from the special feature from Al Jazeera and from Collectively. If you look at some of these histories that I was encouraging you to do, you can find a brief back and forth which provides a wonderful criticism of a similarly gee-whiz article from about 50 years ago, published in National Geographic, about the future of farming. The criticism comes from Wendell Berry, who opens up a 1977 bottle of Epic Kentucky Burn. During most of the article, talking about this National Geographic journalist, he is in the grip of the ignorant awe, the greenhorn's ecstasy that has been as necessary to this revolution as the ball bearing. The accusation here is one of approval registered by amazement, or consent registered by being an open-mouthed spectator. So it's sort of saying, yeah, we agree we should do this, and the way that we are registering our agreement is basically by enjoying the spectacle. And Barry's argument is saying that as long as we stand by in open-mouth amazement at these new technologies and their potentials, that we are part of giving them the fuel that they need. So even if we stayed with this imaginary for a while and considered the rapid rise of vertical farming as an inevitable third green revolution, as de Pommier calls it, it's worth considering whether such a revolution might even be desirable. In my preliminary research, I've assembled a fairly large digital archive. You got to see little bits of it here and there. And especially in the first 10 years of promotion of the concept, the word footprint is rallied most frequently as a pseudo-unit for aggregated negative environmental impacts. And to begin with, this was actually given the direct lineage to the work of Bill Rees and Mathis Wackernagel, the ecological footprint tool, which had been developed at UBC in the 1990s. If you look at promotional materials today, you'll find not as much talk of footprints, more likely to involve specific metrics such as water use, land use, pesticide use, fertilizer use, or to refer to the newer sort of global scale integrated assessment and goal setting tools we have, like planetary boundaries frameworks or the SDGs. But in that kind of 2000 to 2010 phase of development, a reduced ecological footprint, quite explicitly, was the aspiration. And many of these early visionary pitches made direct reference to that book by Bill Rees and Matt Wackernagel, published in 1996. When you go through these videos, you'll see quite a lot of images of the cover of that book, as well as illustrations. The landscape architect Phil Tessendale illustrated that book, and you find these illustrations grabbed because also they're memorable. They're these black and white illustrations of imaginary domes and extra large feet, both in severed and anthropomorphized forms. I have yet to see any evidence that people who are promoting vertical farming using the ecological footprint ever bothered to read the book. Because if they had, they probably would have not mentioned it at all. While the practice of deriving an ecological footprint is largely done in front of a computer screen, working through very coarse agricultural and economic statistics. In the early years of development back in the 90s, some of Bill Rees's students actually went out in the field and talked to farmers. And one of the few kind of empirical ecological footprinting exercises that was carried out was by Yoshihiko Wada, who was a master's student of Bill Rees's. And in 1992, he did field work in a number of greenhouses in operating the Fraser Valley. This was all using state-of-the-art Dutch Venlo technology, kind of like you saw in one of those earlier slides. And then he went to find field sites that were growing the same crop so that he could standardize it to the functional unit of 1,000 tons of tomatoes per year. And then go through the very, very careful and tedious math to say, okay, what about all the concrete that's poured in the foundation of this greenhouse, and how long does it take to depreciate, and what about the steel, and what about the glass, and where did it come from, and what about its supply chains, and what about their electric bills, and what's the source of the power? You get the picture. It's a lot of work. And those of you in industrial ecology, those of you who are involved in life cycle assessments, you know that this is just an awful lot of work. But the thing that made Wada's work different is that he didn't do this solely in front of a computer screen, relying on publicly available statistics that have sort of been reported up and mangled through the various state agencies to the FAO and back again. He actually went out to the field and found some farmers who were willing to open their books so that he could actually look at, okay, how much do you actually spend on concrete here, and can we extrapolate as to how much concrete that actually is, and so it was really quite a contribution to this. And what he found, doing the same exercise between these high-tech Dutch Venlo greenhouses and field production of the same product for the same market from these farms up in Ashcroft, which is in the arid interior of British Columbia, was a paradoxical conclusion. So what he found was that high-yield greenhouses, actually, I've got something here for you. This is one of these strange anthropomorphized foots that Phil Tessendale drew for the ecological footprint. It's got toes. It's creepy. What he's emphasizing is that when you try and keep a greenhouse operating and try and keep all of the machines running, basically to keep that environment controlled, you are asking a lot of a large area of land, possibly more than the area you're asking from the field. So this was this in squares is kind of what he found. The conventional view is that if you want to grow 1,000 tons of tomatoes in a year, you would need 15 hectares in the field, the green squares, or you could go the high yield route and just use 2 hectares of greenhouse. And so this is sort of like the narrative stage 1, is that the higher the yield, the more land you spare. I have looked through, just because there are some assumptions that he makes that seem a little bit questionable. So I've gone through the numbers, and at least when it comes to the agronomic data, you can do a little cross-referencing with FAO stat, which is a fiction of its own. But the nice thing about FAO stat is that it actually aggregates all of this country data. And so to imagine that when you get all of the countries in the world making the same lies, there would have to be some kind of collusion, which is probably less probable than they're all making different lies. And so the hope is that if you get the average of all of these different lies together, that you actually have something which may be a representation of reality. And so it makes a nice check when you're sort of saying, like, are your yield assumptions not so bad? And it turns out that his yield assumptions are not so bad. This is all analysis kind of like within the realm of the possible. those little things are just directions to the Yale College students to say how to use Wolfram Alpha to convert hectograms to tons. And this is what he found. Here's the paradox, is to indefinitely sustain those 1,000 tons of tomatoes, you would need 50 hectares of the field, basically, to maintain that fertility and to think about everything which is involved in the transport and the maintenance of the equipment and its depreciation of the capital and all that kind of stuff. But to do the same kind of sustaining the same output inside these greenhouses using state-of-the-art Dutch technology in the Fraser Valley, he figured 800 hectares is what it would take to keep those 2 hectares humming, producing their 1,000 tons. And that is the founding paradox of vertical farming, because if you believe the ecological footprint analysis, and you grant the idea that inside controlled environments where there is no additional sunlight, that you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot better than the greenhouses that have ample additional sunlight in a single layer. So if you take that every layer of a vertical farm is no better or no worse, roughly equivalent. Be generous and say it's roughly equivalent to a greenhouse. Then the claim that Dixon de Pommier made, which is that basically if we were to move all agriculture indoors, we would save an area of land the size of South America plus an additional Brazil. If you took Wada's theory of change here, you would say, actually, if we moved agriculture indoors, by the end of the century, we would need an ecological footprint 15 times the size of South America plus Brazil. So this is not a quarrel about precision or something happening in the margins or the efficiency of LED lighting. This is not a technical inefficiency challenge that must be overcome, because we're dealing with a quantitative disagreement with a gap of nearly 3 orders of magnitude. So this is not a quarrel about degree, but actually about moral valence. This is actually asking, might this technology be making things better or might it be making things worse? The argument is about the whole sign, right? And so, this is quite fundamental, because if it is fundamentally a damaging technology, if it's fundamentally making things worse and relying on the appropriation of more resources that can be made into land equivalents, then regardless of how efficient we make it, we're just becoming more efficient at trying to dig ourselves out of a hole by going down, right? So this is where the fun questions begin. What's happening in this disagreement? What assumptions are they leaning on? Is it really all just a matter of aesthetics and style and prose, and we have to cling to this one narrative, and so it turns this particular quantitative narrative as one that is inadmissible? Is there something else going on? And the implications of what's happening in this big kind of unknown disagreement of 3 orders of magnitude, they're huge for questions of the sharing versus sparing debate. It is huge for how we consider use to be a category. Behind much of the sparing position is that agricultural land use is kind of a binary. The implication, at least in your head, is sort of like once land is used for agriculture, that is the only thing that it's doing. And so this whole question of use and its exclusivity, and whether or not that use is exclusive or shared, whether it's rivalrous, non-rivalrous, can a piece of land be doing more than one thing at once? Obviously it can. So that might be lurking in there somewhere. This approaches how we consider rewilding. It considers what we might be sparing farmland for, what kind of nature we might want as a more desirable form or configuration. It brings up questions of how research and development, how the risks and the rewards of research and development and knowledge production are shared unevenly between people and places, private sector, public sector. I was rather dismayed to see the USDA advancing public research funding towards vertical farming. My view is that if you have lurking in the background quantitative disagreements of this magnitude, that you're working in an area of risk that is best left to the private sector to waste their money on. But that's not how it's going. Questions of globalization, urbanization, financialization. The only reason why these are getting funding right now is because of a particular model of early stage capital, which is available today that was not available back when General Mills was trying their commercialization of the technology in the early 80s. And it's really hard to tell at this point in my research what that early stage capital is actually after. I've talked to some capital managers who feel that the questions about conservation or food security or anything to do with agriculture at all are insignificant and are really not relevant to the question of where the capital is deployed. The capital is chasing after the promise of artificial intelligence. So it's a classic kind of gold rush move for capital, the idea that, if there's a gold rush, the only way that you are guaranteed to become rich is if you're selling the shovels. Basically let the other people, unlikely get rich. Most of them will go broke. And it may be that the venture capital that's supporting vertical farms is perfectly happy to see most of them go broke, so long as it can gain some kind of proprietary enclosure over the artificial intelligence that promises to run every vertical farm, successful and unsuccessful alike. In here as well are a lot of questions about enclosure and boundaries, and what things we desire to have control over, what factors we insist upon having control over, what factors we're willing to let go of when it comes to having control over. I have 4 questions that I've developed, and these are the kind of like major categories. The first is, what is vertical farming actually promising? And that's where I'm going through all these digital archives, the promotional materials and this and that. The other is, does it actually fulfill this promise? And this gets to the heart of what's going on with that disparity. The third is asking, in that gap between what it promises and what it actually does, what does it fail to do? And then finally, what does it fail to anticipate? These are the unintended consequences. The biggest unintended consequence is if all of this capital of every dimension, all of the straight up cash and all of the, quite honestly, very talented people who are dedicating their time and energy towards the deployment and the development of this technology, if they're working on vertical farming, they're not working on something else. That is something which is quite rivalrous. What kind of things are we foreclosing as we attempt to enclose agriculture? So that's where I'll leave it, and I'll turn it to questions.
We have microphones if you have questions.
Right in the front. Oh, right behind the front.
Thank you. My question is, how much do you think this sort of resurgence of vertical farming, which it seemed to sort of be 10 years ago a topic, and now in the past year or so it's really resurging again, has something to do with the sort of possible rise of like techno-utopianism amongst capitalists in particular? So you mentioned that this really doesn't happen without so much early stage capital coming into it, and you see a lot of people in the Silicon Valley and stuff like that sort of adopting that kind of intellectual stance around climate and climate change.
I think they're very closely correlated. You see throughout food and agriculture a move by Silicon Valley, not just by the people who are involved there, but also by the whole package of logic that they're espousing. You see a very rapid move to try and claim food and agriculture as theirs. And this is obviously with the attention going to meats, but also with novel agricultural technologies, of which vertical farming is one of them. So there is a question about, like, what's the nature of that particular logic of Silicon Valley capital versus the logic of non-Silicon Valley capital. And I think there is something in there. I think if you're looking at the resurgence and why are we seeing this now, I do think that's very closely tied to because we have basically an enormously large pool of money with a particular ideology behind it, and it doesn't know where to go. Right in the front.
So I see a lot of parallels between this and a lot of other things with infographics and nice, easy stats. And I wonder if you think that why it's so appealing to us has more to do with like our culture or something deep within our evolutionary psychology. Why do these solutions appeal to us so much?
I won't attribute anything to evolutionary psychology. I will happily attribute things to culture. And if one thing I've been kind of pondering as I go through this archive is there's a particular way that you are allowed to talk about the future within the bounds of polite Silicon Valley or Silicon Valley inspired company. And there's no room in what's an appropriate narrative for critique. It's almost like pathological optimism, and it seems to be part of what you have to do. And it's almost like there's an arms race of hyperbolic optimism that is attached to that kind of funding. Because the thing is, like, if you don't make a claim which is brighter and greener and more world saving than the other startup next to you, the other startup's going to get it. And so it kind of becomes like, who can make the boldest, happiest claim, and it seems that the folks who are actually deploying the money are sort of like have an allergy to something which is looking critically at it. There's also the problems that capital's always had, in that if there's not a product to sell at the end of the day, then you don't have a viable business model, and that's why if you look at the trajectories of how agricultural inputs have been used versus agricultural structures that might have been employed, right? You could redesign your farm, or you could buy pesticides, and a pesticide manufacturer will pay for R&D so that you'll get better at pesticides, but nobody, because they don't control the question of the intellectual property of how that farm is designed and how it's all put together. They don't have a product to sell. And so if you don't have something that can turn into a commodity, you don't have money behind it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you could describe it through a bunch of different ways. Maybe some factors are cultural. Maybe it's just that we have to only say nice things and we can't say bad things. Maybe it's just capital doing what capital does. There. Yes.
Yes. What is the difference in nutrient density between a concept of vertical farming and a concept of permaculture?
You would be able to measure nutrient density in a vertical farm. If you measured nutrient density in a concept like permaculture or biodynamic agriculture, the thing that you're measuring would cease to be the thing that you're interested in knowing about, because you would have to mangle it so thoroughly to get it into the controls of a laboratory environment to actually get empirical data on it.
Okay. And just briefly, related to that, I think the food of the future is going to have to deal with the problem of farm chemicals. And MIT scientist named Stephanie Seneff is writing a book that should be out within a year, saying we've got a huge problem with farm chemicals. And both permaculture and vertical farming would seem to deal with that problem.
Reed, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm very struck about the parallels between this and the circular economy enthusiasm, in the same way that there is this huge outpouring of promises and enthusiasm and a great unwillingness to look at the numbers and see the disparities. And actually, I was trying to find some readings for my course that talked about the phenomenon of this kind of enthusiasm more generically, and think about the different occasions and different domains where this occurs, and whether there's really a similarity in the phenomena or whether they're quite unique to each other. But I don't think that this is unique at all to vertical farming.
That final slide was from that National Geographic article, which is now 70 years old, The Revolution in American Agriculture. And you don't only have a nice critique of it in Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America in 1977. You also have a good critique of it in Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State from 1993. We have two different takes from two different kind of like critical standpoints that do very nice work on that particular article, and you could basically take that and just sort of search and replace everything about that image and put in vertical farm or put in circular economy, and you would have a lovely critique. I have someone in the far corner and in the back row.
Given this sort of blind optimism in vertical farming, it seems like very intelligent people are working on vertical farming. What are the sort of justifications they have for continuing working on the technology, even if from a thermodynamic perspective it takes more energy to do vertical farming than traditional farming?
I think they're propelled by the claims that Depommier laid out, regardless of how verifiable they are. And if they care about verifiability, which by and large they don't seem to too much because they are really busy trying to sort out the business operation. Like when you, once you get a couple years into this and once you look at the results from the surveys that have been done of early operators, no one has time to look into the figures that inspired them to begin with. They're having to figure out labor, and there's no environmental concern, which is basically a headache on a day-to-day basis anymore. They're dealing with the fact that their robots are not able to handle looking after plants, and they actually have to get people to look after the plants if they want to keep the plants alive, and then they have to work with people and pay them wages and do all that kind of stuff. So labor becomes the number one concern of vertical farm operators quite soon into their dealing with it. And it's just like, these are complex operations. The stress and the pressure of having venture capital kind of like hovering over you, expecting a very quick return, just means that you don't have the time to look into the numbers, and you just sort of have to ride on that wave of something that you might have found really inspiring years ago. And just deal with it. There's not time to kind of like question it, and then if you are to question it, that's like a big crisis of faith moment, because you've invested your entire identity in telling the people who are funding you and who are expecting a return that this is going to work, and so it's sort of like it has to work. It can't not work, and so if those numbers are threatening to make it not work, you do not look at those numbers, right? So you don't have time, and you also don't have the interest to look at those criticisms. So I think that those demands do mean that very, very smart, diligent, hardworking people who are solving incredibly difficult problems, trying to get these things to work, aren't going back into that. And so thankfully, we've got places like Yale, right, where we're not under the demands of a venture capitalist breathing down our necks, so that we can actually stand back and take a more careful look at the numbers. Lovely that you're all here.
We can take one more question.
Okay, in the back row, you had a hand up for a little while?
I did, but I'm okay.
Okay, so we'll go right there in the, I don't know how to describe the color of your shirt, I'm sorry.
Neither do I. So my question is about the constraints on the neighboring land when you do conventional farming. Mm-hmm. Compared to what seems appealing about the concept of vertical farming is that you could put it next to an office building or a coal plant or whatever, but you can't just put a conventional farm anywhere. There are additional constraints on the other land that might not register as opportunity cost now, but could in the future. Have those been monetized? Have those been converted into a analysis where you can actually compare the two in terms of those trade-offs? That is adjacency.
Yeah, I haven't seen that analysis specifically for controlled environment agriculture about constraints on adjacent land uses. Most of the time, the development of these things seems to like fly in the face of any respected models for patterns of urban growth with respect to how land is valued as an asset and about those various adjacencies. And old theories, new theories, they don't seem to care particularly much. And I don't have the answer to that yet. I'm hoping as I ask more questions and figure some of these things out, I might be able to come back to you with that. But I don't know right now how that's being taken into account or ignored. Okay, we're done? Thank you, Melanie.